It was a chilly night, and perhaps even more chilling because a cruel, pointless double murder had just been carried out by an evil wizard. But all was not lost. The wizard was ultimately destroyed by a mother's love for her child. After this turn of events, Professors Albus Dumbledore and Minerva McGonagall were talking quietly right outside of number 4 Privet Drive. Professor Dumbledore was telling Minerva that he was going to deliver that little boy to the Dursleys, the family that lived there, saying he is to live with his aunt and uncle. They are the only family he's got left. Minerva looked sharply at him through her horn-rimmed glasses, and said he's got more family than that. Maybe not by blood, but I'll be damned if I let this boy reside with these horrible muggles. Dumbledore was astounded by her words for a moment, then said calmly, surely they can't be that bad. Minerva sighed as she said, I watched them all day, Albus. They don't like anyone that isn't like them. They would never understand him, nor would they want to. Lily told me about how much her sister and her husband hated her and James. Petunia refused to take part in Lily's wedding day, and even the birth of Harry. She cut off all ties with Lily the day she announced her engagement. Lily was heartbroken. Albus, that sister of hers. Dumbledore interrupted gently, saying is the victim of severe jealousy. You know, I received a letter from Petunia when she was a little girl, shortly after Lily got her Hogwarts letter. She said that she wanted to come to Hogwarts too, but unfortunately when I told her that Hogwarts is only for those who possess magic, it left a nasty mark. That mark seemed to grow into anger and hatred as the years passed. Minerva looked surprised, and Dumbledore sighed as he said, they aren't my first choice either, Minerva. I would have liked to trust Harry with Sirius, Remus or Peter, but I am unsure of which one of them betrayed the Potters to Voldemort, and I do not wish to put Harry in any more danger. Minerva flinched at Voldemort, and said, isn't there a way we can find out which one of them did tell you? No. Oh, all right then, Voldemort. Dumbledore shook his head. Unfortunately, no. If there was a way I would most certainly do it. Minerva said, you can't just leave him here, Albus. There has to be another way. Dumbledore shook his head sadly as he said, I'm afraid there isn't. Minerva was silent for a few moments, and Dumbledore pulled out a couple of lemon drops from his pocket and popped them in his mouth as he sat down on the bench near them. She sat down next to him and kept thinking, who else could care for the boy? Surely there must be someone. She then thought about little Harry's fame, how he would be known by all wizards and witches, and said, but Albus, couldn't a wizard family take him in and raise him? Surely there are plenty of witches and wizards that would give their right arm to raise Harry. He'll probably go down in history as a legend for Merlin's sake. Dumbledore said, that's exactly why I think the best option is for him to be raised by the Dursleys. That way he'll grow up away from all that, and when he is of age he will be ready to understand it. Minerva shook her head, saying these muggles will never care for Harry like a real family would. He needs. What's that noise? They heard a loud roar coming from the sky, and as they looked they saw a light that was coming closer and closer, until it landed on the street in front of the house. They saw a huge figure carrying a bundle of blankets get off what appeared to be a large motorcycle. Dumbledore sounded slightly relieved as he said, Hagrid. Thank goodness you have arrived safely. Where did you get this motorcycle? Hagrid smiled through his heavily bearded face, and said, Sirius Black let me have it, sir. Dumbledore nodded and said, was there any trouble getting Harry out of Godric's Hollow? Hagrid shook his head, and said, nope, I go little Harry out before the muggles started coming round the destroyed house. He fell asleep as we was flying o'er. He looked affectionately down at the little bundle of blankets, and Hagrid allowed McGonagall to take the little boy into her arms. As she did so, Hagrid pulled a dirty handkerchief out of his pocket, and blew his nose so loudly it sounded like the low note of a trombone. McGonagall shushed him, and soon he started sobbing loudly, saying, I'm sorry. I can help it. Little Harry being raised by these muggles, and I won't see him again for a long time. Dumbledore patted Hagrid's arm gently, and said, I know, but he will be safer here. McGonagall suddenly had an idea. It may be crazy, but it was the only choice she had left. Albus. There are no sufficient reasons why Harry should be a burden here. It seems I have no choice. I will raise him myself. Dumbledore looked surprised, while Hagrid looked completely shocked. Hagrid asked Dumbledore, can she do that? Dumbledore looked at Minerva through his glasses, which seemed to have a twinkle in them as he said, Minerva, I am touched that you would take on all this responsibility, but I truly feel his best chances with the Dursleys. Minerva said exasperatedly, Albus, we've been over this. He'll be treated like a pet by these people. They would not care for him the way his parents would have, even if they are blood related. I would raise the boy with the understanding that when the time comes he can accept what happened, and should Voldemort rise again, he may be in danger. I will care for him as if he were my own, which is what Lily and James would have wanted. She finished with tears in her eyes, as did Hagrid. He wiped his away with his sleeve though since his handkerchief was too wet to use anymore. Dumbledore was silent for a moment, and said I came here with the intention of leaving Harry in the care of the Dursleys. Minerva was about to object, but Dumbledore held up his hand, signaling her that he wasn't finished, and said but I didn't think that I would find someone even better to raise the boy who lived. Professor McGonagall, if you wish to raise Harry, I think you will make a fine guardian. Raising a child is not easy, but I figure you know that already. Minerva nodded with tears in her eyes, and she smiled down at Harry as she was reminded of her daughter, who was now full-grown and married off. Dumbledore smiled, and said very well then let us discuss details back at Hogwarts. I see no reason to still be here on Privet Drive. Hagrid said yeah as he got back on the motorcycle, and Dumbledore asked do you wish to apparate with me, Minerva? She nodded, and linked arms with Dumbledore, while still holding little Harry. She smiled, feeling that she made the right choice, and saved the little boy from a childhood of unhappiness. Raising Harry, Chapter 2. Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall apparated to Hogsmeade, with little Harry still fast asleep in her arms, and as they walked towards the school, Dumbledore said quietly Minerva, I'm glad that you wish to ensure a happy future for this little boy, but are you sure that you can handle all of this responsibility by yourself? Professor McGonagall said don't worry Albus, I know I'm no spring chicken, but I'm more than capable of taking care of a little boy on my own. We can further discuss this once we get back to your office. On our way there, however, I do think Poppy should take a look at the boy, just to make sure he isn't hurt at all. They dared not speak Harry's name, in fear that Voldemort's followers might be lurking around, and still after him. Once they arrived at the school, Dumbledore said if you wish to take Harry to Madame Pomfrey, I shall retire to my office and we can talk there in a few moments. She nodded, and said I will be there shortly as she looked down at Harry in her arms, and smiled softly at his sleeping form. She thought to herself as she walked he's been through so much in one night, it's no wonder he's tuckered out. As she arrived at the hospital wing, she called for Madame Pomfrey, who came in wearing a white robe over her blue-striped, long nightgown, and her brown, slightly graying hair was down. She asked nervously is everything all right, Minerva? McGonagall said I'm sorry to wake you Poppy, but it's important she said as she lifted the blue blanket from little Harry's head, revealing his lightning bolt scar. Madame Pomfrey gasped, and said oh dear. Let me check him over. Professor McGonagall asked do you know who this boy is, Poppy, as Madame Pomfrey took the little boy into her arms, and she replied no, but in a moment I will. McGonagall said sadly there's no need, this is James and Lily Potter's son, Harry. Madame Pomfrey looked horrified, and nearly fainted, but remembered that she was holding the little boy. This is Harry. Oh Minerva, James, and Lily. McGonagall nodded, with tears in her eyes. So you heard about what happened, I take it? She nodded, and said the whole school has been buzzing about it all day, but I wasn't sure what to believe. I can't believe it, oh James and Lily. She started to cry, and McGonagall wiped a few tears from her eyes beneath her horn-rimmed glasses, and said I know, Poppy. I didn't want to believe it either, but we must carry on. I need to go talk with Albus, but I would prefer to take Harry with me, since it does concern him as well. I thought he could use a checkup here just to be safe, so would you mind, dear? Madame Pomfrey said oh, not at all Minerva, just give me a moment or two. She laid Harry gently on one of the beds, and using her wand, scanned his body for any internal or external injuries, and said he seems to be fine, he's obviously been through a great ordeal, the poor little thing. I will go fix up some warm milk in a jiffy, just so that you have something to feed him once he awakes. McGonagall nodded, and said thank you Poppy, however would it be possible to remove that scar? She shook her head, and said I'm afraid not, it's a mark inflicted by an evil man filled with dark magic, and those scars can never be healed. McGonagall nodded, and once Madame Pomfrey gave her a bottle of milk, and put Harry in her arms once again, she headed towards Dumbledore's office. When they arrived at the entrance to Dumbledore's office, McGonagall said the password quickly chocolate frogs and was let in. She called out Albus. He answered, I'm over here, Minerva, and she spotted him petting Fawkes, his phoenix, who seemed to have been reborn once again. She looked at the tiny phoenix, and said, Albus, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but would you mind holding Harry while I transfigure one of your chairs into a crib? He took the little boy, and said it would be my pleasure. She nodded, and transfigured one of the chairs in front of his desk into a white crib with a red and gold comforter for Harry to sleep in as she talked with Dumbledore. He came over and said, I see you added some Gryffindor pride into it, as well as he gently laid Harry in the crib. McGonagall said yes. Well, James and Lily were both sorted into my house, so I thought it would be a nice touch. They both smiled softly at each other, and Dumbledore walked behind his desk as he said, please, sit down, Minerva, and let's discuss where we go from here. She nodded, and sat down as he requested. He started by saying, first of all, as you know, no one must know Harry's whereabouts, and he should grow up somewhere where he will not be recognized. McGonagall said, I'm aware of that, and I have the perfect place in mind. You see, since my husband died, and then my daughter got married, I have been unsure of what to do with the house that I left. It's a good-sized house, and it would be ideal for Harry because it's located in a Muggle neighborhood. He nodded, and said, very well then, and I assume that you have the funds to support him. She said, yes, my husband left a good amount of money to me, as well as our daughter, and the income that I earn for working here at Hogwarts is more than sufficient. He nodded once again, and said, good, now we come to perhaps the most important question, will you be able to raise him while you're working as a full-time teacher here? He is only a year old, so he will most likely require full-time care. She said, I'm also aware of that myself. I'm not sure how I can manage both, and it will look suspicious if I go on leave from my duties here at Hogwarts for a few years. I don't suppose you have a suggestion? Dumbledore looked thoughtful for a moment, and then he said, I think I may know someone who can help. She was close to the Potters as well, and was a student here along with them. McGonagall looked surprised, and asked who, Albus. He smiled as he said, bring Harry, and come with me. I know where we can find her. Her name is Katrina Belmont. At Katrina's house. Katrina had just awoken from a troubled sleep. She heard the news the other night that her dearest friends, Lily and James Potter, were murdered by Voldemort. She cried herself to sleep the night before, and she had nightmares about that, as well as what might have happened to their beautiful little boy, Harry. She immediately put on her pink plush robe over her long white nightgown, and her dark brown curls flowed down to her back. Her eyes were still slightly puffy and sore from the night before, and just as she put the kettle on the stove to make some tea, she heard a peculiar pop noise coming from her front yard. She hastened to the door, and opened it to find Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall, who appeared to be carrying something in a blue blanket she recognized as the one she gave to Lily just before Harry was born. She said shakily, Harry. Professor McGonagall nodded, and handed the baby over to Katrina, who hugged the baby tightly as tears streamed down her face. Oh Harry, thank goodness you're safe. Raising Harry, Chapter 3. Katrina held little Harry for a few moments longer, almost forgetting that Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall were there. She quickly said, oh. I'm so sorry. Please, do come in. Dumbledore smiled softly as he and McGonagall came into the tiny cottage, and Katrina showed them to her crimson sofa, and they all sat down. Katrina continued to cradle little Harry in her arms, but then handed him back gently to McGonagall, as she grabbed a tissue from the tissue box on the coffee table and dabbed at her eyes. She then smiled softly as she said, thank you for letting me hold him, I'm glad he's safe. Dumbledore smiled kindly as he said, Miss Belmont, I take it from your greeting you are aware of what happened to the Potters only one night ago. She nodded solemnly as she said, yes, I can't believe they are gone. She sniffled and a few tears fell, and McGonagall reached out and patted her hand, saying, I know dear, I know it's a difficult time, but we need your help. She dabbed at her eyes once again, and asked, of course, what is it you need? Dumbledore said, we require your assistance to raise Harry. She looked shocked, and said, me. Raise Harry? But, I don't even know how to raise a child. I would love to, but I don't know how. What made you choose me? McGonagall said, you wouldn't be raising him by yourself, Miss Belmont. I took on the responsibility of raising Harry, but I will require assistance during the day while I am teaching at Hogwarts. Dumbledore nodded, and said, and to answer your question, I chose you because you are the only person I know I can trust at the moment, and it is clear how much you loved the Potters, as well as Harry. She smiled, and then looked questioningly at him as she asked, what about Sirius, Remus or Peter? Surely they can be trusted. Sirius is his godfather. Did they do something to suggest they can't be trusted? Dumbledore sighed as he said, I'm afraid that's the problem. I'm not sure which one of them can be trusted. One of them is responsible for informing Voldemort of the Potter's whereabouts. Katrina gasped as she stood up and said, no. I can't believe that. They would have died rather than betray James and Lily. Couldn't it have been someone else who told Voldemort? Dumbledore said, I'm afraid not, Miss Belmont, it had to be one of them. We will find out who is responsible, but for now it must not be discussed any further. Katrina nodded as she sat back down, and said, I'm sorry, Professor, it's just that I knew them all, and they were the sweetest, kindest guys I'd ever met. I just find it all very hard to believe. McGonagall nodded in agreement, saying, I know, I found it hard to believe myself. But anyways, we don't have much time. Would you be willing to help me raise the boy? I know it's a lot of responsibility, but I really do need someone to care for him during the day, and give him the attention and care that he needs. Will you do it? Katrina thought for a moment, and then replied with a smile, I'll do it. McGonagall smiled and hugged her as she said, thank you, Miss Belmont, this means a great deal to me, and I'm sure it would have meant a lot to Lily and James as well. Katrina smiled as McGonagall released her from the hug, and Dumbledore smiled with that twinkle in his eye behind his half-moon glasses as he said, thank you, Miss Belmont, it is greatly appreciated. However, now we must go over the details. Katrina nodded, and Dumbledore continued, you will need to be relocated for the time being, as no one can know where you are. Katrina said, all right, as long as I can take my cat with me, would that be all right? Her black cat walked in, and she picked him up and held him as McGonagall smiled and said, of course, you both will be staying at my house in a Muggle village. Katrina smiled as she said, thank you, Professor, and okay. Is it far from Hogwarts? McGonagall said, it's not too far away from Hogwarts now that I think about it actually, and I think you will like it there. Dumbledore smiled and said, now all we need to discuss is the years to come until Harry is of age to come to Hogwarts. McGonagall and Katrina nodded, and he continued, no one can know that you are helping to raise Harry, let alone where you will be, so if you must communicate with your friends, please be aware of this. Katrina said, the only friends that I am still in touch with are Sirius, Remus and Peter, but I suppose I can't do that anymore, can I? Dumbledore shook his head as he said, I'm afraid not, it's too big of a risk. She nodded sadly as she said, well, it'll be worth it if we can keep Harry safe. I just hope Harry will get to know them again someday. Dumbledore said, I'm sure he will in time. For now, let's focus on giving him a safe and good future. They all smiled softly in agreement, and Katrina said, I guess I'd better start packing my things. McGonagall said, yes, we will wait out here while you pack. Katrina nodded, and immediately went to her closet and pulled out her 3 dark pink suitcases, and 2 traveling bags. She quickly changed into a pair of jeans, a black tank top, a dark pink fleece jacket, and a pair of pink and grey sneakers. She put her long, wavy dark brown curls into a ponytail, washed her face and brushed her teeth, and put on her silver necklace that her parents gave her as a graduation present. She then took a deep breath, and started packing up all her clothes, shoes, books, blankets, everything she would need with her. After all, she would be gone for a long time, who knows if she'd ever be able to come back. But she reminded herself, it's all worth it if I can ensure Harry's safety, it's what James and Lily would have wanted. She then smiled to herself as she knew she was making the right choice, and finished packing. As she brought out all her bags, and finished packing a few other little things from her living room, she put her cat in his cage, and said, I'm ready. McGonagall smiled as she said, good. I turned off your kettle for you while you were packing. That reminds me, you might want to dispose of all the perishable items in your kitchen as well. Katrina nodded, and after she did just that, using her wand, she shrunk all of her luggage to the size of a thimble and put them in her pocket, except for the cat, of course. She carried him in his cage by hand. Dumbledore said, I should probably go back to the school and take care of matters there. I trust you two will be at your house for most of the day, Professor McGonagall. She nodded, and said, I'll let you know when we're finished getting settled, Albus. He nodded, and with a pop, he was gone. McGonagall still held Harry as she linked arms with Katrina, who carried her cat in his cage, and asked, ready, Miss Belmont? Katrina looked around at the tiny house, both saying goodbye and making sure she didn't forget anything at the same time, and after a moment, she said ready. With a pop, they apparated back to McGonagall's home, the start of a long journey that awaited them. Raising Harry, Chapter 4. Professor McGonagall and Katrina arrived at the front door of McGonagall Mansion, and Katrina's eyes widened at the sight of it. It was beautiful. It was rather large, but not overwhelmingly so. It still felt homey. It was an off-white mansion with large windows that had crimson shutters, and there was a small garden planted along the sidewalk leading to the door, with red and yellow roses. The front door was crimson just like the shutters, and had a lion's head door knocker. Professor McGonagall smiled at how in awe Katrina was as she admired the house, and said, "It's absolutely lovely, Professor." McGonagall replied, "Thank you, Miss Belmont, I've always liked it myself." As they entered, Katrina looked in awe of the house. Everything was neat and tidy, and McGonagall said, "I come back once in a while to make sure it's well kept and clean. My husband always liked it that way." Katrina put her hand on McGonagall's shoulder comfortingly as she sensed she was getting a little emotional. She loved her husband very much, and when he died suddenly of a deadly spider bite, she was heartbroken. McGonagall turned and smiled at Katrina and said, "Why don't you hold Harry for a moment while I set up a room for you, Miss Belmont?" Katrina smiled and said, "Of course, thank you, Professor." McGonagall nodded as she pulled out a handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes beneath her horn-rimmed glasses and walked up the gold-railed, crimson-carpeted staircase. Katrina looked down and smiled as she saw Harry yawning adorably as he awoke from his sleep. She said softly, "Good morning, sleepyhead." Harry looked up at her, and said, "Goo." She giggled at the little boy in her arms, and McGonagall was coming down the stairs as she said, "I see Harry is awake. Your room is settled, Miss Belmont. It's right upstairs to the right, the first door. I'll take Harry and see if he's hungry." Katrina nodded and handed Harry back to McGonagall, and picked up her cat carrier once again and headed upstairs to her new room. When she arrived at her room, she grinned as she walked inside. It was perfect. The walls were a soft pink, with white furniture, a bookshelf with plenty of books, and even a little bed for her cat. She immediately closed the door behind her, and put the cat carrier down as she let her cat out of it, and sat down on the pink and white polka-dotted comforter on her bed. She smiled and looked to her cat, who was checking out his new little pink pet bed, as she said, "I think we're going to like it here." She then got up and took her luggage out of her pocket and using her wand returned it all to its normal size. She managed to unpack everything in less than an hour, and had just finished, when she heard a knock on her door. She said, "Come in," cheerfully as she let her wavy chocolate brown hair down out of its ponytail and brushed it while looking in the mirror on the dresser. She noticed McGonagall through the mirror, who seemed to have a sad expression. "Professor? What's wrong? Is Harry all right?" Katrina asked, her brows furrowing in concern, and McGonagall replied, "Miss Belmont, I'm afraid I have bad news. It involves your friends." Katrina gasped and asked, "Remus? Sirius? Peter? Are they all right?" McGonagall sighed as she handed Katrina the Daily Prophet, and Katrina gasped in horror as she saw the story on the front page, "Sirius Black found guilty of murder and betrayal." Katrina said angrily after she finished reading the article, "This is a load of rubbish, Professor. Sirius would never betray Lily and James, and he would never murder anyone." McGonagall said, "I thought so too, but who else could it be?" Katrina had a look of determination as she said, "I've got to see Professor Dumbledore." McGonagall looked surprised as she said, "But you can't." But Katrina interrupted, saying, "Professor, please. I need to help my friend. He was one of my closest friends, he was always there for me, now it's my turn. Azkaban for Merlin's sake. Poor Sirius, he must be terrified." She looked pleadingly at McGonagall, and she finally caved in, saying, "Oh, all right. But please be careful, Miss Belmont." Katrina smiled softly as she said, "I will, Professor, don't worry." She grabbed her black, hooded cloak and headed to the outside of the mansion, and with a pop, she apparated to Hogsmeade. She arrived in the middle of Hogsmeade and walked to Hogwarts, and as she arrived at the gates, she hurried inside wearing her cloak with its hood up. She walked quickly to Dumbledore's office and said, "Chocolate frogs," as the statues let her inside. She immediately said, "Professor, I'm sorry to bother you, but she pulled back her hood, and saw that Professor Dumbledore was talking to Severus Snape. Snape looked startled as he saw her, and Dumbledore said, "I'm sorry, Miss Belmont, just give me one more moment. She nodded and waited around the doorway, and as Snape left the office, she approached his desk and said, "Professor, I..." Dumbledore held up his hand and said, "I take it you saw the Daily Prophet this morning." She nodded, and she continued, "Please Professor, I need your help. My best friend is in trouble and he needs help. He couldn't have killed anyone, let alone tell Voldemort about the Potters. They were practically his family. He would never..." Dumbledore interrupted gently, saying, "I know, I couldn't believe it myself, but what is it you wanted for me to do?" She said as she took a deep breath, with determination in her hazel eyes, "I need to go to Azkaban and see him." Dumbledore looked surprised, and said, "I see, are you sure you want to do this, Miss Belmont?" She nodded, and he said, "All right, I will escort you to Azkaban. Please follow me." She nodded, and they walked over to his fireplace, and he took some flue powder as he said clearly, "Ministry of Magic, a department." She followed in suit, and repeated what he said as she too threw flue powder into the fireplace, and in an instant found herself next to Dumbledore, who was talking to a peculiar-looking man with a magical glass eye. He said, "Alastair, it is imperative that Miss Belmont and I go to Azkaban to see Sirius Black. We need some information from him." Alastair looked at them both suspiciously, and as he looked at her, said warningly, "It's a dark, damp and soul-sucking prison. Are you sure about this visit?" She nodded, and he said as he looked at Dumbledore and turned around, "All right, I'll take you to there. Can't say I didn't warn you," and mumbled that last part. He said brusquely, "We'll have to apparate, each of you hold on to my arm." Katrina and Dumbledore each grabbed one of his arms, and with a pop, they were at the entrance of Azkaban. Note: yes, Ministry officials could apparate there, they possess a wand and can do it. I checked on Harry Potter Wiki. Katrina put her hood up once again, and shuddered as she entered the place. She and Dumbledore followed Alastair to the prison gates, who announced to the Dementors guarding it, "Sirius Black has some visitors. They are with me." The Dementors made Katrina shiver, and she suddenly felt as though she would never be happy again. She snapped herself out of it though, she had to be strong for her friend. She followed Alastair with Dumbledore right behind her, and they were led through the cold, unforgiving walls of the prison to Sirius's cell. Once they reached the cell, Alastair told the Dementor floating around it that Sirius had visitors, and he told Katrina and Dumbledore gruffly as he unlocked the cell door, "Go ahead in, I'll wait out here." They nodded, and entered the cell, and Katrina's heart sank at what she saw. Sirius was hunched over in the corner of the cell, his semilong ebony hair covering his face, and she heard faint sobs coming from him. She said softly, "Sirius." He looked up immediately, and asked, "Who are you?" She mentally face-palmed herself as she forgot to lift her hood from her face, and did so as she said, "It's me," with a soft smile. He gasped and got up shakily as she ran over to him and hugged him, and he said, "Katrina." She nodded with tears in her eyes. She said, "Oh Sirius, are you all right? I saw the Daily Prophet this morning, and I knew I had to see you." He released her from the hug, and as she pulled away she saw his face wet with tears, and she pulled a handkerchief out of her pocket and handed it to him. He said softly as he wiped his face, "You shouldn't have come here, I didn't want you to see me like this." She said, "I knew you could use a friend right about now, especially after hearing about James and Lily." Sirius remained silent, and she said, "Sirius, I know you didn't tell Voldemort. And I know that you didn't kill those muggles." He said, "It's all my fault, I should have." Katrina interrupted, saying, "Sirius, this is not your fault, and I'm going to try my hardest to get you out of here. You don't belong in here." He said softly, "Maybe I do." She said, "Sirius, please." This time he interrupted, saying, "Katrina, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it won't work. Those gits at the ministry won't believe me, or you. Just leave it be, please. I deserve to be here." She frowned. He had convinced himself that he was guilty, and there was nothing she could do. She felt helpless. She watched him sit down in the corner of the cell again, and she sat down next to him as she said quietly, "They will always be with you, Sirius. Don't ever give up on yourself, you're one of the bravest men I know." He choked on a sob, and she turned and hugged him once again, and he returned it, sobbing into her shoulder. Her heart broke as all she could hear were his heart-wrenching sobs, but she knew that he had to let it out. After a few minutes, he released her, and Alastair said, "Time to go." She stood up, but Sirius grabbed her hand as he said softly, "Thank you." She smiled softly, saying, "What are friends for?" She squeezed his hand before letting go, and Dumbledore followed her out of the cell. She followed Alastair back to the entrance, and they all apparated back to the ministry. Once they got back, Alastair said, "I told you it was a horrible place. Black deserves it though." Katrina glared at him as she said fiercely, "He's not guilty." She suddenly felt faint, and Dumbledore put his hand on her shoulder as he asked, "Are you all right, Miss Belmont?" She held her forehead and said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I think I just need something to eat and to lie down for a while." He nodded and said, "Let's get back. Thank you for your help, Alastair." He nodded, and headed off as Katrina held on to Dumbledore's arm, and he said, "I'll escort you back to Professor McGonagall's home. I don't think you should apparate there by yourself in your condition." She nodded weakly, and they were gone with a pop, once again. When they arrived back at the mansion, McGonagall answered the door, and looked concerned as she said, "Miss Belmont. Are you all right?" Katrina nodded weakly and said, "I'm all right. I think I just need some food and rest." She tripped, but McGonagall caught her arm and held on to it as she said, "Thank you for returning her here, Albus." He nodded, and said, "I will see you soon, Professor McGonagall, and I hope you feel better, Miss Belmont." She nodded with a small smile, and McGonagall closed the door, saying, "I knew I shouldn't have let you go on this mission. Dementors are disgusting creatures," and she continued to ramble as she helped Katrina sit down on the crimson sofa in front of the fireplace in her living room. She then said, "Wait here while I get you something to eat." Katrina said, "You don't have to," but McGonagall already left, and Katrina tried to get the look of despair she saw in Sirius's silvery grey eyes out of her mind. She looked around the room, and noticed a lovely cherrywood coffee table in front of her, and a handsome row of cherrywood bookcases filled with books. McGonagall then rushed in as she said, "It's a good thing I went to the market in the village near here while you were gone with a tray containing a sandwich, a bowl of fruit and a tall glass of water." She said, "Now eat up, you need your strength." Katrina smiled as she said, "Thank you, Professor, I really appreciate it," as she bit into her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. McGonagall smiled as she said it was no trouble. "I'd better go check on Harry. Once you're done though, you should go get some rest." Katrina nodded as McGonagall left, and once she was finished, she felt much better, so she put her tray on the coffee table in front of her, and headed upstairs to her room. As she entered, she closed the door behind her and picked up her cat as she hugged him and said, "Poor Sirius, I hope he will be all right." She let go of her cat, who leapt from her arms onto the bed, and Katrina sat on the bed as she took off her socks and shoes. She then curled up on the bed, thinking about what the next years held in store for her, as well as her friends, and especially Harry. She thought about little Harry as she drifted off to sleep. Raising Harry, Chapter 5. Katrina awoke abruptly to the sounds of a wailing baby, and despite her grogginess her maternal instincts kicked in and she rushed towards the sound. When she reached the room which the crying was coming from, she saw Professor McGonagall wearing an emerald green long bathrobe and her graying brown hair down in a braid, holding the baby. She was trying to rock him to sleep in her arms, but it was no use, so Katrina stepped inside and said, "Let me try, Professor, you need your sleep so you can teach classes tomorrow." McGonagall jumped slightly and said, "Miss Belmont, I thought you would still be asleep. What are you doing up at this hour?" Katrina smiled tiredly and said, "I heard Harry crying from my room, and I rushed towards the sound. I've always been a bit maternal, can I try?" McGonagall looked surprised for a moment, and then smiled softly as she said, "Of course," and handed her the little boy. Katrina took Harry in her arms gently, and took the blue blanket that she had given to Lily just before Harry was born to hold him with, and wrapped him in it as she walked to sit in a nearby crimson chair. She hummed one of her favorite songs from a favorite movie of hers growing up, Disney's Sleeping Beauty. As she hummed the theme song from the movie, she noticed Harry's fussing seemed to calm down, and he curled up contentedly in her arms after yawning. She smiled down at him as she continued to hum for a few minutes longer, while Professor McGonagall watched in surprise. After the few minutes were up, Katrina put Harry in his crib gently and softly brushed his hair from his face, showing the little lightning bolt scar on his forehead. McGonagall said quietly, "I'd say you're hired, Miss Belmont. I had no idea that you had such a maternal touch." Katrina blushed slightly at the compliment, and said, "It's a bit of a habit, I must have picked it up from Lily." She suddenly looked like she wanted to cry as memories of the times she and her best friend had flooded her mind. McGonagall took notice of this, and put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, saying, "It's a remarkable trait, Miss Belmont, you should wear it proudly in her honor." Katrina smiled tearfully, and said as she took a deep breath, I should probably go get some sleep. I've got a long day of babysitting a 1-year-old tomorrow. Good night, Professor. McGonagall replied, yes, good night, Miss Belmont. I will see you in a few hours. Katrina smiled and left for her room to get a little more sleep. Katrina's alarm went off only a few hours later, 6:24, and after turning off the alarm, she yawned and stretched as she pulled on her pink bathrobe and slippers, and headed downstairs to make herself some caffeinated tea. Once she arrived in the kitchen, she saw McGonagall wearing her usual teaching robes in emerald green, and her black pointy hat with her hair wrapped tightly in a bun. She had set Harry down in a high chair, and noticed Katrina. "Good morning, Miss Belmont, would you care for some tea?" she asked, and Katrina nodded thankfully, and said yes please. "Did Harry sleep all right the rest of the night?" McGonagall nodded, and said as she handed her the mug of tea, "He just awoke a few moments ago. I have to get to the school now to finish grading the essays for my class. Will you be all right?" Katrina nodded as she took a sip and put the mug down, and said, "If I need anything, I'll you, Professor." She nodded, and said, "All right, well I'll see you later, Miss Belmont." Katrina said with a smile, "Have a good day, Professor," as she walked towards Harry. She said, "Hello Harry," cheerfully, and he smiled at her and bounced up and down in his high chair. She asked, "Are you hungry, little guy?" Harry made some gurgling noises happily, and Katrina smiled as she decided to whip up a little treat for Harry. She remembered that she brought her blender with her from her house, as it was a gift from her parents, so she ran upstairs to fetch it. As she found it tucked away in her closet, she heard Harry start crying and rushed to get him, blender in hand. She asked Harry, "What's the matter?" as she quickly put the blender on the counter, then picked him up and checked his forehead for a fever with her hand. He said faintly between sniffles, "Mama," and her heart sank, and she hugged Harry tightly as she said, "I know sweetie, I miss them too," as tears streamed down her face. She took him to the sofa in the living room, and sat him down across from her, and said as she held him with one hand and wiped his tears with the other, "But you know what, Harry? They are always with you. They will always watch over you, and they love you very much." He still wailed slightly, saying, "Mama, the..." She had a hard time stopping her own tears from falling as well, but she then decided to pull herself together. She held Harry in her arms as she rocked him back and forth, humming another Disney tune. This time it was A Spoonful of Sugar from Mary Poppins, and he seemed to relax. She smiled softly, and asked him, "Feel better, sweetheart? How about we get you some food, huh?" She picked him up and placed him back in his high chair once again, and then blended up some strawberries and a banana in the blender. She scooped out some of it and put it in a little bowl, and brought it over so she could feed Harry. She spotted a spoon on the edge of the counter and rinsed it off before using it to stir up the strawberry-banana mixture, and started to feed him. He opened his mouth, and she put a spoonful into it, and he happily ate it. She smiled, and continued to feed him for 15 more minutes before she put the bowl and spoon in the sink, and took a napkin and wiped Harry's mouth clean. She picked him up, and carried him upstairs to his crib. As she put him down in it, she felt his diaper to make sure it wasn't wet, and it wasn't, so she laid him down in the crib, humming a soft tune of Feed the Birds from Mary Poppins. He fell asleep after a few moments, and she smiled down at him, and kissed his forehead softly before leaving the room quietly. As she got herself dressed and ready for the day, she smiled, so this is what it was going to be like for the years to come. Even though he was a daily reminder of the loss of her friends, he was a new light in her life, and she couldn't wait to spend each day with him. Harry, 2 to 3 years old. By the time the next year rolled around, McGonagall and Katrina had a system down pat to their care for Harry. Katrina handled Harry during the week, while McGonagall handled him on the weekends and just before she left for Hogwarts in the mornings. Harry had been adjusting nicely to his new home and family. He even started calling Katrina Mum, and she didn't have the heart to tell him otherwise. He called McGonagall Auntie, which made her smile every time she heard it. Harry had learned how to go to the bathroom, how to feed himself, although messily, how to walk, and even how to talk a little more. He had nightmares frequently, but once Katrina was there to hum or sing him, he always fell asleep with no problem. McGonagall had also begun reading to him every night before bed, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Harry, 4 to 5 years old. Harry was showing all the qualities that his parents had, Lily's brains and James's mischief-making. He was a handful all right, but Katrina and McGonagall enjoyed every moment. Harry now slept in the guest room next to Katrina's until she and McGonagall renovated a room for him. One night a frightened Harry awoke from a nightmare, and ran to Katrina's door and knocked shakily, asking Mum. He heard a voice ask tiredly, "Harry, come in, sweetheart." He came in, and said, "Mum, I had a bad dream." Katrina sat up and motioned for him to come join her on the bed. She gathered him in her arms and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie, do you want to tell me about it?" "It's okay if you don't want to." Harry said, "I saw a monster, and it chased me. I cheated to get away, but it kept coming to get me." He began to cry a little, and Katrina wanted to cry as she saw his adorable face with that little pout and tears falling from his emerald eyes. She hugged him, and as she turned on the lamp next to her bed, she brought him under the covers with her, and said, "Shush, it's all right, baby, the monster wasn't real. He's gone now, and you're safe. Do you want Mummy to hum another song? Would that make you feel better?" Harry nodded, wiping his tears with his little hands, and she said, "All right, let's see, what song would you like for me to hum?" "A Spoonful of Sugar." He shook his head, and said, "Whistle while you work." She smiled and said, "All right, sweetie, I'll let you sleep here with me tonight, okay?" He smiled a little, and she smiled back as she began to hum the song from Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. She hummed to him until he was asleep contentedly in her arms, and she kissed his forehead gently as she said softly, "Good night, my little boy," and turned her lamp off as she fell asleep holding him. Raising Harry, Chapter 6. With each passing year, Katrina tried her hardest to get her friend Sirius out of Azkaban. She wrote letters to the ministry, talked to some of the witnesses, and even went straight to the minister himself. Just as Sirius said, however, the minister would not believe her. One day she marched into the minister's office, and he said, "I'm sorry, Miss Belmont, this is the 5th time you've visited my office, and each time I've told you there is no evidence proving otherwise. Even if he did not inform you know who of the Potters' whereabouts, he still killed 12 muggles, along with poor Mr. Pettigrew." Katrina said angrily, "He did not kill anyone. I've known the man for a bleeding 8 years. Just because he has the Black family name, that does not make him like them, and he is certainly not a merciless killer. I demand a trial for him." The minister seemed to be unfazed as he continued working on his paperwork, and said offhandedly, "It's touching how much you care for your friend, however Mr. Black will remain in Azkaban. Unless you have cold, hard evidence to back you up, your words mean nothing. Good day, Miss Belmont." Katrina left the office frustrated and heartbroken, and after she apparated back to McGonagall Mansion, she ran inside and curled up on her bed, crying, while her cat sat at her feet. She didn't hear McGonagall come in with little Harry, and as McGonagall set Harry down on the floor so he could walk over to her, she sat beside Katrina's crying form on her bed. She reached out and patted her shoulder, sensing that the minister still refused to release her friend, and Katrina said shakily, It's just not fair. Sirius is innocent," as she sniffled, and McGonagall frowned. She was still unsure of what to believe herself, but she had a feeling Katrina was right. 6-year-old Harry came around to face Katrina, and said with a sorrow face, his emerald eyes shining with concern, "Please don't cry, Mum." Tears continued to stream down her face, but she smiled softly at the little boy, and opened her arms for him to come and snuggle with her. He gladly came into her open arms, and she held him until they both fell asleep. McGonagall smiled at the sight, and closed the door quietly as she left the room. Harry, 7 years old. When it came time that Harry would turn 7 years old in less than a week, Katrina had told Professor McGonagall that she believed it was time that Harry knew who he was, and who his real family was. "Professor, I think we need to talk. It's about Harry," Katrina said as she came into the kitchen late one night as McGonagall was making some herbal tea. McGonagall nodded, and said, "All right, what's on your mind?" as she handed Katrina a mug of herbal tea, and pouring herself a mug as well. They both sat down at the kitchen table, and Katrina said, "I think it's time for Harry to learn the truth about his parents. As much as I love that he thinks I'm his mum, I think he needs to know from young about his real family, like who they were, what they stood for, and what they died for. If we wait until he's older, he will be angry with us for keeping it from him for so long, and I don't want that to happen." McGonagall nodded, and said as she sipped her tea, "I agree. However, I don't think it would be wise to tell him about how the Potters were discovered that night. He's too young to understand what happened, even I don't understand it." Katrina nodded in agreement, and said there are parts of it I don't understand either, but I will tell him about Sirius, Remus and Peter as I knew them. She then thought about Remus, and hoped that he was okay. She remembered how she fell in love with him during their years of school together, but he never knew. Only Lily knew. "Miss Belmont. Are you all right?" asked McGonagall, and Katrina snapped out of her thoughts and said "HM. "Oh yes Professor, sorry. I was just thinking about Remus, I hope he's okay. I wish I could have sent him an owl to ask if he was all right after James and Lily were killed. Poor Remus, he must feel so alone." Katrina looked down sadly, and McGonagall frowned, and said "Well Miss Belmont, normally I wouldn't advise you to go against Dumbledore's orders, but if you wish to send Mr. Lupin an owl to make sure he's all right." Katrina looked up in surprise, and ran over to her and said as she hugged McGonagall gratefully, "Oh thank you Professor. I promise it will only be one time, I just need to make sure he's okay. So we can tell Harry tomorrow?" McGonagall nodded, and said tomorrow. Katrina nodded as she put her tea mug down, and dashed to her room to start writing the letter. McGonagall smiled softly, for she too noticed Katrina's affections for Remus while they were at school, and had hoped that one day he would return her feelings. Katrina sat down at her desk, quill in hand and wrote. "Dear Remus. I'm so sorry for not sending you an owl sooner, but I had to make sure you were all right. I'm sure you were as devastated as I was that night when we heard the news of James and Lily. Then to find out about Sirius and Peter the next day, but Remus, you must know that Sirius could not have told Voldemort, and I don't believe you did either. I visited Sirius at Azkaban that very day, you know. He was so scared, it broke my heart to see him like that. He needs us now more than ever. I can't tell you where I am or what's happening in my life right now, but I'm safe, and I hope you are too. I'm only allowed this one message, but please reply to let me know that you are all right. Please believe that Sirius is innocent, and above all, believe in yourself Remus. You're a wonderful person, and a good friend, and you are not alone. Your friend, Katrina Belmont." She sent the letter with McGonagall's owl, and hoped that he would reply soon, for she always thought about her friends. She then changed into her pajamas and went to sleep, dreaming of the times she had with James, Sirius, Remus, Peter and Lily at Hogwarts. She awoke early the next morning to a tapping on her window, and as she ran to the window, she blearily saw McGonagall's owl hovering right outside. She let him in quickly, and he dropped the letter into her hands. She stroked his back affectionately, and said thank you as she opened the letter with slightly trembling fingers. It read. "Dear Katrina. Thank Merlin you're safe. I was worried when I didn't hear from you. I stopped by your house to check in on you the day after the news of James and Lily, but you were gone. I feared the worst, but I'm glad I was wrong. As far as Sirius goes, I'm not sure what to believe. I want to believe he's innocent, but who else could have told Voldemort? I can't believe that you actually went to Azkaban to see him. You truly are a dear friend. I'm glad you're safe, and yes, I'm safe as well. I'm truly touched by how much you care for Sirius, as well as me. Thank you for your kind words. Your friend, Remus Lupin." Katrina heaved a sigh of relief, and smiled softly at his kind words in return. She remembered how sweet and warm-hearted he was in their school days together, and how ashamed he was of his condition. He never told her about his being a werewolf, but he didn't have to, she knew. She researched it in her 3rd year, but she never told him that she found out. She didn't want him to feel that she thought any less of him because of it, so she kept it secret, and she admired how strong he was while handling it. She put the letter on her desk before getting dressed for the day, and it was a very important day indeed. Tonight they would tell Harry the truth. Raising Harry, Chapter 7. That evening when Professor McGonagall returned home from Hogwarts, she walked into the kitchen to find Katrina baking some scones. Katrina loved to bake and cook, as McGonagall soon discovered after she moved in with Harry. McGonagall smiled, and Katrina had just taken a batch of scones from the oven, and she caught a glimpse of McGonagall over her shoulder, and said, "Hi Professor. Just in time, I decided to whip up a batch of chocolate chip scones before we talked with Harry." McGonagall nodded, and said, "I can see that, and they smell wonderful Miss Belmont." Katrina smiled as she replied, "Thank you." She had just finished plating her last batch of the scones when Harry came down the stairs and said as he entered the room, "Chocolate. Katrina looked up and saw little Harry walking over, and she smiled at the curiosity that shined in his emerald eyes. Yup, fresh chocolate chip scones. You can try one in a minute, let them cool first, but Harry. Harry looked up and said yes, Mum. Katrina put the pan and spatula down on the counter as she got down to Harry's level and said, Harry dear, Auntie and I need to talk to you about something very important, okay? Harry nodded, and sat down in a chair at the kitchen table as Katrina and McGonagall did also. Katrina said, Harry, before we tell you this, we want you to know that it doesn't change the fact that we will always be a family, and we love you to the moon and back. McGonagall nodded in agreement, and Harry nodded understandingly, and Katrina took a deep breath and said, okay, here it goes, Harry, sweetheart, I'm not actually your real mum, and Auntie isn't really your aunt. You had a mum and dad. Harry looked surprised, and said, but what happened? Why aren't they my family? McGonagall sighed sadly as she said, your real parents were killed by an evil man. Harry's brows furrowed as he asked, but why my parents? Katrina and McGonagall shared a look, and McGonagall answered, well, Harry, no one really knows the reason why. All we know is that he was a very dark, power-hungry man, and he sought to get rid of all those who didn't agree with him. After he killed your parents, he tried to kill you as well, that's how you got that scar on your forehead. No one knows why or how, but somehow he couldn't kill you, and he disappeared that very night. Katrina nodded, and continued, your parents were very brave, Harry. They protected you until the very end, and they loved you with all their hearts. Harry's eyes filled with tears, and Katrina said, oh, sweetie, I know this is a lot to take in, as Harry wiped his tears with his sleeve. Harry asked what were their names. Katrina said, your real parents were dear friends of mine, named James and Lily Potter. Your name is Harry James Potter. Harry asked after a few moments, who are you, and how did you get me? McGonagall answered, I'm Professor Minerva McGonagall, and I chose to raise you myself. A man named Professor Albus Dumbledore asked a man named Hagrid to collect you from your home, and he brought you to me. However, once I realized that I needed help taking care of you during the day while I had to work. McGonagall looked to Katrina, who continued, that's when they came to me and asked me to help raise you. I'm Katrina Belmont, I knew your mum and dad. They were my best friends, and we even went to school together. Harry asked, really? Katrina nodded, and Harry asked somewhat excitedly, could you tell me about them sometime? Katrina smiled and said, of course, sweetie. If you'd like, I can start telling you about them when I tuck you in tonight. Harry grinned, and said, oh boy. Thanks Katrina, Katri, would it be okay if I still called you Mum? And then Harry looked to McGonagall and said, and can I still call Minia, you, Auntie? McGonagall chuckled as she nodded, and Katrina smiled as she said, of course, honey. Harry smiled and Katrina said, now make sure after you finish your scone you brush your teeth, change into your pajamas and get into bed, and I'll be right there, okay? Harry nodded as he quickly finished his chocolate chip scone, and said thanks Mum, cheerfully as he went off to do as she asked. She smiled as she watched him go, and McGonagall said, well, that went better than I expected. Miss Belmont, I'd say that we have raised a very fine boy so far, James and Lily would be very proud of him. Katrina looked at her and smiled as she said, they certainly would, and I'm glad you asked me to help raise him, Professor. It's been so wonderful to watch him grow, and I see so much of James and Lily in him. McGonagall patted Katrina's hand as she said, I'm glad too, Miss Belmont. You've not only been a great help to me, but a wonderful mother to Harry. Lily would have been proud. Katrina smiled, and McGonagall got up from the table and said, you should probably go and tuck in Harry, he's anxiously awaiting your stories of his parents. I'll clean up in here. Katrina chuckled and said as she too got up from her seat, are you sure? I don't mind quickly cleaning up. McGonagall said, I really don't mind dear, go on. Katrina smiled, and said, all right, thank you Professor. McGonagall nodded as she busied herself with putting the scones away in a container, and Katrina headed up the stairs to Harry. Katrina walked into Harry's new room. It was a spacious room, connected to a bathroom. It was painted in a lovely shade of crimson, with dark wood furniture, including a small desk, dresser, and a few other small tables and chairs. There was also a bookcase filled with Harry's favorite books, as well as a few toys lying around. Katrina asked as she came in, Harry, darling. Are you ready? Harry was sitting in his bed waiting patiently as he said yes mum. Katrina smiled, and said all right as she sat down on the side of his bed. What would you like to know? Harry looked thoughtful for a moment, and finally he asked what were they like. Katrina grinned as she recalled, and said oh, well let's see, well your father, James Potter, was a mischief maker, just like you can be sometimes as she poked him ticklishly in the ribs, causing him to giggle. She then continued, he was tall, handsome, had messy, jet black hair, striking hazel eyes, and a smile that charmed most of the girls at school. He was very, very clever, and was always there right when you needed him. He was a very good friend, and had a big heart. Harry grinned, and Katrina said now your mother, Lily Evans, on the other hand, was beautiful, with long red hair, remarkable emerald eyes, a lovely smile, and was very, very smart. She was one of the nicest people you could meet at our school, and was always helping others. She too was a very good friend with a big heart. Harry smiled, and Katrina said oh Harry, I see so much of both your parents in you as she put a hand gently on his cheek. She continued, you look so much like your dad, but you have your mother's eyes. You have a big heart, and are very clever and smart, and oh they would be so proud of you as her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. Harry's smile faded slightly, and Katrina said well Harry I think it's time for bed, but tomorrow night I will tell you more, okay? She helped Harry get under his covers, and he asked do you still love me even though you're not my actual mum? Katrina said as she sat back down on the side of the bed oh Harry, of course. I have always loved you, and I always will. You will always be my son. She hugged Harry, and he said I love you, mum, and Katrina replied I love you too sweetheart. Once she released him from the hug, she got up and walked out of his room, turning the light off in his room and said sweet dreams, Harry. She walked back to her room, and smiled as she thought of all that had happened tonight. Raising Harry, Chapter 8. Harry, 7 to 8 years old. Ever since Katrina and McGonagall told Harry about who his parents were, he had requested a story about his parents and their friends every night. Of course Katrina couldn't refuse his pleading emerald eyes, so she told him stories such as, I remember I went to the hospital wing to check on Remus when he wasn't feeling well, and each time I did, your mother would be right there by his side every time, with 3 chocolate bars in hand and taking care of him. Of course your father, Sirius, and Peter would always be by his side too, as they were as close as brothers, making him laugh and helping him to forget that he wasn't feeling well, even for just a little while. Oh there were times I felt so overwhelmed by all the homework I had to do, that I would be on the brink of a panic attack or feeling really nervous before exams, but your mother would always talk me down and help me calm down. Your father and Sirius, and sometimes Remus and Peter, would play jokes on many of the students at school, much to your mother's dismay and your auntie's slight amusement. One time your father, Remus, and Peter somehow made it so a big black dog came in and ate their homework, right in front of their teachers. For some reason Sirius wasn't there for that one, but somehow his homework got eaten too. Your father was in love with your mother from the very start, their first day at school. He always tried to impress her and flaunt his talents in front of her, but she didn't fall for his charm one bit. Not until later, at least. She fell for the kindness and maturity he began to show her during their 6th year. She found herself falling in love with him, and so the next time he asked her out, she finally said yes. Soon they had graduated from their school, and a year later they got married, and shortly after that they had you. Oh, they loved you so much, Harry. The week after Harry turned 7 years old, Katrina began teaching him the basic Muggle subjects, reading, writing, math, and little bits of history and science. He was very smart just like his mother, so he picked things up fairly quickly for a boy his age. Katrina grinned with pride when he learned how to spell supercalifragilisticexpialidocious in less than a day. He didn't mind reading, writing, and learning about history, and he was clever when it came to math and science. By the time he turned 8 years old he had finished learning all that was covered in school up to the 4th grade. When Katrina tested him on his knowledge and he did well, she would reward him with his choice of favorite dessert or a story about his parents and their friends. Most often he chose the latter. Harry, 9 years old. Now this was the age where Harry's magical abilities had started to show. Katrina noticed it one day as she was baking in the kitchen. Harry liked to help her in the kitchen sometimes, and as they made McGonagall's favorite chocolate pecan chip cookies, She noticed that when Harry moved away, the wooden spoon kept stirring the batter by itself. She was about to point it out to Harry, but thought better of it as she had to discuss it with McGonagall first when she got back later. She took her wand out discreetly from her pocket and froze the spoon in place just before Harry got back. She smiled at him as they added in the chocolate chips and pecan pieces to the batter, and he smiled back. By the time the last batch of cookies was baking in the oven, Harry had been working on his math and reading homework, and Katrina was cleaning up. McGonagall arrived back at the house, and said, "Good evening, Miss Belmont. Are those my favorite cookies I smell?" Katrina grinned as she turned to McGonagall and said, "Yes, they are." "Happy birthday, Professor." McGonagall smiled fondly and said, "Oh my. How did you know?" Katrina giggled as she said, "I sent Dumbledore an owl to confirm it the other day, but I recall that a certain couple of marauders stole a peek at your records in Mr. Flicker's office." McGonagall chuckled, and said, "Somehow that doesn't surprise me, those boys were always looking at things they shouldn't have. But thank you, Miss Belmont, I truly appreciate that you remembered." Harry came bounding in the kitchen with a handmade card in hand, and gave it to McGonagall, saying, "Happy birthday, Auntie." She smiled at the boy, and said, "Why, thank you, Harry," as she leaned down and hugged him. She read the card, which was in a surprisingly semi-neat handwriting, as Katrina had taken the last batch of cookies from the oven. "Happy birthday, Auntie. I hope Mum and I can make your day special. Lots of love. Harry." McGonagall's eyes watered slightly, and she hugged Harry once again, saying, "Thank you, Harry, you have made my day." He grinned and Katrina smiled at him as she said, "Okay, sweetie, I think it's time for you to get ready for bed, you have a spelling test in the morning." He nodded, and she added, "I'll be there to say goodnight in a minute, okay?" He shouted as he headed upstairs, "Okay, Mum." Once she was sure he was upstairs, she said, "Professor, you won't believe what happened today," as she plated a couple of cookies for McGonagall and handed it to her. McGonagall asked, "What is it?" Katrina said in a lowered voice, "Harry showed his first sign of magic." McGonagall looked surprised and slightly excited as she asked how. Katrina said, "Okay, earlier Harry and I were mixing the batter for these cookies, and as he left the bowl to go to the bathroom, the spoon was mixing the ingredients on its own." They grinned, and Katrina said, "I think it's time to talk to Harry about it. But I want it to be special and exciting for him." McGonagall nodded, and said, "I agree, but as far as making it special, I don't know." Katrina said, "Oh, please, Professor. He really doesn't ask for much, he's unspoiled and giving, I just..." McGonagall chuckled and said, "Oh, all right. What did you have in mind, Miss Belmont?" Katrina smiled and said, "I thought about it earlier, what if..." Once Katrina tucked Harry in for the night, she and McGonagall stayed up late discussing Katrina's plan for Harry's 10th birthday surprise. Raising Harry, Chapter 9. The morning of Harry's 10th birthday had arrived a week later, and Katrina was practically leaping for joy as the surprise she had been planning for him was about to revealed. Katrina came into Harry's room, and she smiled at the sight of him sleeping peacefully as she brushed a few stray hairs from his forehead, barely touching his lightning bolt scar. She said softly, "Harry, sweetheart. It's time to get up." Harry muttered sleepily 5 more minutes and Katrina chuckled as she said, "Okay, well then I guess you'll miss your surprise." Harry then jolted awake and asked curiously, "What surprise?" She laughed and said as she handed him his glasses from the nightstand next to his bed, and kissed his cheek, "You'd better hurry and shower and get dressed so you can come get your breakfast before we take you to your surprise." He nodded with a grin, and she left the room with a grin of her own. She prepared a breakfast of Harry's favorites, chocolate chip pancakes with strawberries, scrambled eggs and small maple sausages, with a tall glass of pumpkin juice. About 10 minutes later, Harry came bounding down the stairs wearing a pair of dark jeans, a red t-shirt, and a pair of white sneakers with red stripes, his jet black hair as messy as ever, and his emerald eyes sparkling with anticipation. He grinned as he saw the spread of his favorite foods at the kitchen table, and Katrina said, "Happy birthday, honey." He hugged her and said, "Thanks, Mum." She smiled as he released her and she handed him a plate, saying, "You're most welcome, now eat up. We've got a big day ahead of us." Once they finished breakfast, and after Katrina changed from her pajamas into a pink tank top with a white cardigan, a pair of light jeans and some white sandals, they set off. Katrina had planned for her dear friend from Hogwarts to help her reveal the big news to Harry, because to her, there was no Hogwarts without him. Perhaps Harry could be his friend there too, just as he was with her. McGonagall had created a portkey out of an old lunchbox for Katrina and Harry to use that day, and promised that they would all meet up at the end of the school day and go home together. Before they left, Katrina asked on a serious note, Harry, I have a very important question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe in magic? Harry thought for a moment, and he said, I suppose so. I always thought that it was just in my storybooks, but I'd like to believe it happens in the real world too. Why? Katrina smiled, and said, that's exactly what I said at your age when I was asked that. You're about to find out. Hold on to this lunchbox at the exact moment I do, okay? Harry nodded with a questioning look on his face, and at the same moment they both grabbed onto the lunchbox, and were lurched forward and hit the ground in front of the gate to Hogwarts. Katrina got up immediately, ignoring her nausea as she ran to Harry and helped him up, asked Harry, dear, are you alright? I know it takes some getting used to. Harry held his head for a moment, and Katrina handed him his glasses after making sure they weren't broken, and he answered, yeah, I am fine, I think. I feel a little nauseous, though. Katrina said, it always makes me nauseous too, but it'll pass by the time we get to my friend's house. Harry looked up in awe after putting his glasses on, and said, wow. Your friend lives here. It's humongous. Katrina laughed as she said, oh, no, this is a school, Harry. I went here. Oh, it's a wonderful school. I think you'll love it here as much as I did, and your parents did. You'll be coming here once you turn 11. He gaped at her as he said, really? She grinned and said, yup. Now let's go, as they passed through the gates, and walked along the school grounds to reach a cozy-looking hut. Katrina grinned as she felt the summer breeze flow through her brown waves, and when they reached the door, she knocked on it. A few moments later a huge, heavily bearded man answered the door, wearing a ruffled apron over his long-sleeved, rolled-up shirt and long pants with boots, and a look of delight clear in his beetle eyes. Katrina grinned as she said, hello Hagrid, and hugged the man, barely reaching his waist. He said, Katrina. How good to see ye. Haven't seen ya for a long time, as he hugged her back, and she said, I missed you. As she pulled away, he pulled out a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his eyes, and he said, I wasn't sure what happened to ye, and when McGonagall told me ye'd be coming today, and that Harry will be coming too, and now to see ya, all grown up, as he blew his nose, sounding like the low note of a trombone. As Katrina patted his arm gently with a smile, Harry stood behind her, looking very bewildered, impressed and unsure of what to think of what just happened. Katrina said, speaking of Harry, here he is, as she pulled Harry in front of her, putting her hands on his shoulders reassuringly. Hagrid's eyes widened as he said, Pew, how did ya? Katrina said, I'll explain, but I think it would be best to tell you inside to avoid any unwanted ears listening in, and Hagrid said, of course. Please, come in. Katrina smiled as she and Harry went inside, and Hagrid offered for them to sit down on his green sofa. Hagrid caused the ground to shake a little as he plopped down in a large red armchair, and his eyes crinkled as he smiled, and said, Harry, my ye've grown since I last saw ye. Ye were only a baby then, o' course. Harry nodded, and then blurted out, who are you, causing Katrina to look at him slightly disapprovingly yet amused all at once. Hagrid chuckled as he said, I'm Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts School o' Witchcraft and Wizardry. Ye know about Hogwarts, don't ye? Harry shook his head no, and Katrina said, Harry, will you please excuse Hagrid and I for a second? Harry nodded and stayed put on the couch while she and Hagrid went into his kitchen. She said, Hagrid, what I'm about to tell you is something that you can't tell anyone, okay? Professors Dumbledore and McGonagall know, but no one else can know. Hagrid nodded, and she continued in a hushed voice, when you brought Harry to Professor McGonagall, she realized she needed help raising Harry while she had to work, so she came to me and asked for my help. I've been helping to raise Harry. Hagrid looked surprised, and said, I had no idea. Well, I'm sure you're a wonderful mum to Harry. I won't tell a soul. Katrina smiled, and said, but we haven't told him about magic, until today. And that's when you come in, Hagrid. I want for you to tell him. Hagrid looked shocked. Me? Why me? Katrina smiled as she said, I couldn't think of a better person than you to help me tell him about our world, Lily and James's world. Plus, there's no Hogwarts without you, Hagrid. Hagrid smiled tearfully, and hugged her once again, and as she let go, she said, "Now, let's go tell him." She said, "Harry, dear, come sit at the table in the kitchen with us, we have something to tell you." Harry obliged, and as he joined them, Katrina smiled at him and Hagrid said the 4 words that started it all: "You're a wizard, Harry." Raising Harry, Chapter 10. "I'm a what?" Harry asked disbelievingly, and Katrina said gently, "A wizard, Harry. You can do magic, just like your mother and father." Harry looked even more surprised, and said, "No, that can't be, I'm just Harry. I don't even know how to do magic." Hagrid said as he chuckled slightly, "Well, just Harry, have ye ever noticed strange, unexplainable things happen when ye were scared, or angry?" Harry thought for a moment, and Katrina smiled as she said, "I know it's a lot to take in, but you don't have to know everything about magic right away. This school is all about learning how to use magic, and you will do wonderfully, sweetheart. Your mother was a gifted witch, and your father was a very clever wizard, it's in your blood." Harry smiled slightly, and Katrina said, "And, Harry, there's one more thing we should tell you before we go somewhere else special to celebrate your birthday." Harry nodded, and Katrina continued, "Do you remember when Auntie and I told you about your parents and the evil man who killed them, and almost killed you?" Harry nodded once again, and Katrina pressed on, "Well, that despicable man was actually an evil wizard. Once it got out that your parents were killed by him, and you lived, it became known all around the world. In our world, the wizarding world, you're famous. You are known by many as the boy who lived." Harry's emerald eyes widened in surprise, and asked, "But, why did he want to kill me in the first place?" Hagrid said, "No one knows, Harry. Maybe he thought he could persuade em, maybe he just wanted to get rid of em since they were close to Dumbledore, or maybe he just liked killing those who didn't agree with him." Harry was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, "Is he still alive?" Katrina and Hagrid looked at each other, and Hagrid answered, "They say he disappeared the night he tried to kill ya, but no one really knows either. But don't ye worry, Harry, you're safe with Katrina as your mum, and you're away from other witches and wizards who might blab to any of you know who's followers. With Professors McGonagall and Dumbledore protecting ye too, you're going to be safe from anything he or his followers can do." Harry nodded, but questioned, "You know who? Does he have a name?" Hagrid said, "I don't like saying the name if I can help it." Katrina said, "His name is Voldemort," causing Hagrid to shudder, and she said, "I don't believe in fearing his name. But Harry, sweetie, I just wanted to tell you this so that next year when you get your Hogwarts letter, and you come to school here, you wouldn't feel overwhelmed with it all then, okay?" Harry nodded, and looked somewhat scared as he asked, "What if I'm a terrible wizard? What if I can't do magic like everyone else? What if—" Katrina interrupted him as she put her hand over his comfortingly and said, "Harry, you are related to the most brilliant witch and wizard I ever knew, and even if you aren't as good at it as they were, that doesn't make you any less of a person. You will always be a clever, caring and wonderful boy, and I know you will become a great wizard." She smiled at him, and he smiled back, and she said, "Well, Hagrid, what do you think? Should we head off, then?" His eyes crinkled as he smiled through his heavily bearded face, and he said, "Yeah. Let's get going," as he got up from his seat, and Katrina and Harry did too. She took Harry's hand, and said, "Now, for the fun part of your surprise." Harry grinned as he asked, "Where are we going?" Katrina said, "You'll see," as she too grinned, and the trio walked out with Hagrid, where he took a very dusty plastic cover off of what appeared to be a large motorcycle. Harry's eyes widened, and Katrina asked, "How did you get Sirius's bike?" Hagrid said, "It's a long story, I'll tell ye another time." She nodded skeptically, and he hopped on the driver's seat of the bike, and pointed to the sidecar attached to it and said, "Hop in. There's room for ye both, I know I's a bit small, but ye both shall fit." Katrina got into the sidecar first, and there was barely enough room for Harry to squeeze in front of her. Thankfully he had always been a skinny boy just like his father was, and she had always been slim. Hagrid handed helmets and goggles to each of them before putting his own on, and once he finished, he put his large hands on the handles of the bike, and asked, "Ready?" Katrina smiled and said, "Ready when you are," and Harry said, "Yeah," somewhat nervously. Hagrid said with a grin, "Hold on tight, now," and Katrina wrapped her arms around Harry, while Harry held onto the sides of the sidecar. Hagrid started the bike, causing a loud thundering sound, and the vehicle shook violently as he moved the bike forward, and in a moment they found themselves flying through the air. Hagrid's shaggy hair flew behind him, as did Katrina's brown wavy hair, and both exchanged excited grins. Harry had a grin of his own as he enjoyed the strong breeze flying in his face, and felt the rush of adrenaline as they flew up into the clouds. About an hour and a half later, they arrived in a dark, damp alley. As he parked the motorcycle, they all got out and left their helmets and goggles there, and Hagrid put the keys in his pocket. Hagrid smiled at Harry as they all went inside what appeared to be a pub called the Leaky Cauldron, and Katrina held Harry's hand as they followed Hagrid quickly through the bar, trying to remain unnoticed. They slipped out the back door to the pub, and when they reached a brick wall, Harry said, "We're at a dead end." Katrina smiled as she said with a wink, "Not if you know the right combination." Harry looked puzzled, but then Hagrid pulled out a small pink umbrella from his overcoat, and used it to tap a certain combination on the bricks of the wall. Sure enough, the bricks folded themselves away much to Harry's amazement, and they saw a beautiful town ahead of them. Hagrid said, "Welcome to Diagon Alley." Katrina grinned, and said, "This is where witches and wizards shop, kind of like the village we live near, except no muggles can shop here." Harry looked confused for a second as he asked, "Muggles?" Hagrid answered, "Non-magic folk." Harry understood, and nodded as he looked around. Katrina's warm hazel eyes watched Harry as he looked in awe of the place, and she let go of his hand as she said, "Take a good look around and see where you'd like to go first." He nodded and walked quickly to look through the windows of the shops, while Katrina and Hagrid hurried to keep up with him. Hagrid said, "It's going to be a long day," as he chuckled, and Katrina smiled as she said, "Probably, but it's worth it to see a smile on his face." Hagrid nodded in agreement, and they continued following Harry as he peered into window after window in awe.